Okay, we started with Palestine, an historical perspective, with an introduction by Dave Hunt from his book, Chapter 6 of The Gathering Storm. And we got to the point of the God of the Bible declares that as the end of time drew near, all nations would be united against Israel. Are we not close to that now? I don't think we have much more than 7 or 8 years. I'm not counting, because I'm not sure of the calendar. But God declared, Dave Hunt says, that as the end drew near, he would make Jerusalem a cup that causes reeling to all the peoples around, and that they would be all united against Israel. Zechariah 12:2-3. Those little minor prophets there, boy, they have a lot of stuff in them, despite their shortness. And so it is. Ancient Israel had many independent enemies at various times. Remember the Six-Day War and the other war in 1948? And they were victorious each time. And it looked like God has just brought them along. But ever since Israel's rebirth in 1948, for the first time in history, all the countries surrounding her are now united to destroy her, not just some here and there. It is Islam, not in existence until 1,200 years after this prophecy and 2,000 years after the birth of Israel, that unites these nations who otherwise would be fighting one another in the common goal of annihilating Israel. In obedience to Islam, Muslims have pursued that passion fiercely for nearly 60 years. The dispute is over ownership of Jerusalem and the promised land God gave to Abraham and his heirs. The Israelites are Abraham's heirs by descent from him through Isaac and Jacob, whose name God changed to Israel. In opposition, Arabs who call themselves Palestinians make the impossible claim of descent both from Abraham through Ishmael and also from the original Palestinian inhabitants of that land. But Abraham was from Ur of the Chaldees, and Hagar, Ishmael's mother, Sarah's maid, was an Egyptian. Certainly neither Ishmael's mother nor father was the descendant of the original inhabitants of Canaan. In fact, there never was a Palestinian people, nation, government, language, religion, culture, economy, or history. As a matter of fact, Palestine was renamed after Alexander the Great died and gave power or ownership were taken by his generals. And the one general over Palestine, I forget his name, he called it Palestine. This claim by Semitic Arabs of being descendants of a non-Semitic people who allegedly lived for thousands of years in a land called Palestine is a blatant hoax intended to delegitimize the Israelis and claim the land of Israel for themselves. Yet the world accepts this fraud, and all of the peace plans for the Middle East are founded upon it. Even America, they go by this, but they know history. Both sides agree that God gave the land of Canaan, which became Israel, to Abraham and to his heirs forever, and it was never rescinded ever. And that Ishmael was Abraham's firstborn son, whereas Isaac was the second, but the firstborn of Sarah and of the promise. The custom in Abraham's day, acknowledged in the Torah, gave the firstborn prior claim to the inheritance. The Torah also records the fact that Abraham was satisfied with Ishmael as his sole heir, considered him to be the son God had promised, and didn't even want God to give him another son. Genesis 17:8. We'll give him that. Now, from those facts, the Arab descendants of Ishmael sound like the legitimate heirs. Actually not, because in Scripture it says the heir through Sarah. However, there was no such land as Palestine in Abraham's day, and thus no such people as Palestinians in those days, from whom any of today's Arabs could claim descent. In fact, Ishmael's descendants settled in the Arabian Peninsula hundreds of miles from the land God gave Abraham. So God brought Abraham into the land of Canaan, and the Canaanite, not the Palestinian, was then in the land. God gave that land by an everlasting covenant to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, not to Ishmael. In obedience to God, Abraham settled in the land of Canaan, Genesis 13:12. It was then inhabited by Canaanites, Kenizzites, Canaanites, Hittites, Perizzites, Rephaims, Amorites, Girgashites, and Jebusites, Genesis 12:6, 13:7, 15:8 to 20. Check these out, and so on. Many. If today's Palestinian Arabs, I quote that in quotes, are descended from the original inhabitants of the land of Canaan, which they are not, which one of those listed above would it be? In fact, no descendants of the original inhabitants of Canaan have survived to this day. What does the name Palestine mean? The word Palestinian is never found in Scripture. The term Palestine is used 4 times in the King James Version, Isaiah, Exodus, Isaiah, Joel, but never as synonymous with either the land of Canaan or the land of Israel. The Hebrew word is Palinsheth, or referred to a small region also known as Philistia, the land of the Palestine or Philistines. Sound familiar? There are no Arabs here. It was in the area of the Gaza Strip of today, so named after the Philistine city of Gaza. Their other cities were Ashdod, Gath, home of Goliath, Gerar, and Ekron. Those who currently claim to be Palestinians are Arabs who moved in from surrounding countries to feed off the prosperity of the returning Jews, who had turned desert and malaria-infested swamps at the cost of many lives into prosperous farms. Even today, the Palestinians mostly look to Israel for employment. Now they want to own it. Nor can any descendants of Ishmael claim that land. God rejected Abraham's desire for Ishmael to be the son of promise. Rather, he was the product of Sarah's and Abraham's unbelief and conniving. God insisted upon giving a son called Isaac to Abraham by his wife Sarah, and he did so, naming him as the sole heir, a fact that the Bible makes very clear. Thereafter, God referred to Isaac as Abraham's only son of the promise. Biblically, there is no question that God selected Isaac to be the heir to the promised land. That fact is stated not only in Genesis 17, but repeated throughout both Old and New Testaments. 12 times the God of the Bible is called the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob, Israel. More than 200 times he calls himself or is called the God of Israel. Never is he called the God of Ishmael. Much less is he ever called the God of the Arabs or of anyone else. Hear the word of the Lord. Remember his covenant forever, the word which he commanded to 1,000 generations, which he made with Abraham, and his oath to Isaac. Also confirmed it to Jacob for a statute, to Israel as an everlasting covenant. To you I will give the land of Canaan for your inheritance. 1 Chronicles 16:15-18. Furthermore, God clearly tells Abraham, Genesis 15, that his heirs to whom the land will be given will be afflicted by another nation for 400 years, and only then will they be brought into the promised land. It is indisputable history that the slavery happened to the Jews in Egypt, not to the Arabs. But there were 2 reasons for Israel's lengthy enslavement. 1, at the time of God's promise to Abraham, the wickedness of the Canaanites was not yet so great as to justify destroying them, but in 400 years it would be. 2, isolated in Egypt, the Israelites, as despised slaves, did not intermarry with the Egyptians, but became an established ethnic group to be led en masse into the promised land, and we know who they are today. In contrast, the descendants of Ishmael were a nomadic people prone to intermarry with those with whom they traded. The Bible records at least 3 groups with whom Ishmael's descendants intermarried. The Midianites, to the extent that sometimes the Midianites are called Ishmaelites, and sometimes the Ishmaelites are called Midianites. And Esau's Edomite descendants, who had already intermarried with the Hittites. Far from being taken by God into Canaan, they settled into the Arabian Peninsula, where they became known as Arabs. Point C. The Quran stipulates that Jerusalem belongs to the Israelites. Although Jerusalem is found 811 times in the Bible, it is never mentioned once in the Quran, nor are the words Palestine or Canaan. Moreover, the Quran agrees with the Bible that the land was given to Israel and possessed by those chosen people after the deliverance from Pharaoh at the Red Sea. There it is, Surah 5:70. We made a covenant of old with the children of Israel, Surah 5:70. We brought the children of Israel across the Red Sea, and Pharaoh with his host pursued them. And we verily did allot unto the children of Israel a fixed abode. We favored them above all peoples. Pharaoh wished to scare them from the land, but we drowned him and those with him in the Red Sea altogether. And we said unto the children of Israel, dwell in the land, and hereafter we shall bring you out of various nations. We delivered the children of Israel from Pharaoh. We chose them purposely above all creatures. Remember Allah's favor to you. He gave you what he gave no other of his creatures. O my people, go into the holy land which Allah hath ordained for you. Surah 95, 20-21. That's not in the Bible. That's right out of the Quran. Yet in spite of these clear declarations in the Quran, Muslims insist that this land belongs not to the Jews as descendant of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, but to the Arabs as descendant of Abraham and Ishmael. Therefore, Israel's very existence and, above all, its occupation of Jerusalem are intolerable insults to Islam. They should burn their Quran. Only by driving the Jews from what the world erroneously calls Palestine can Arab-Muslim honor be restored. Wow. You read one thing and say another. The Bible, people do that, but you can go back to the Bible and say, look at it and see what it says. I do that all the time. Somebody says, oh, yeah, you can lose your salvation. I say, chapter and verse, please. And they walk away. How did the word Palestinian originate? In AD 130, here it is, the Romans, who had destroyed Jerusalem 60 years before, rebuilt it as a pagan city with a temple to Jupiter on Temple Mount. An uprising of the Jews in protest was finally quelled in AD 135 at the cost of about 500,000 Jewish lives, with thousands sold into slavery and many thousand driven into exile. Despite the Jews, the Roman conquerors angrily renamed Israel Provincia Syria Palestinia after the Philistines. From the time those living there were known as Palestinians. Who lived there? Jews. It is they who became known as Palestinians. Yet Bibles by major publishers have maps with such labels as Palestine under the Maccabees or Palestine in the time of Christ. Such maps promote a grave error. In World War II, the British Army had a volunteer brigade called the Palestinian Brigade. It was made up of Jews. The Arabs were fighting on Hitler's side. There was the Palestinian Post, a Jewish newspaper, and the Palestinian Symphony Orchestra, a Jewish orchestra. In fact, Arabs refused to be called Palestinians. For example, to the 1946 Anglo-American Committee of Inquiry, Arab historian Philip Hitti declared there is no such thing as Palestine in history, absolutely not. Who is to blame? In 1956, Ahmed Shukeri testified to the UN Security Council, it is common knowledge that Palestine is nothing but southern Syria. 8 years later, in 1964, Shukeri, an Egyptian, became the first leader of the Palestine Liberation Organization, later headed by Arafat. He is also not a Palestinian, but was born in Cairo, Egypt, on August 4th, 1929. What was the PLO going to liberate in 1964? East Jerusalem and the West Bank were held by Jordan, while Egypt held the Gaza Strip. In fact, the PLO was not formed to liberate Palestinians, but to destroy Israel, and without any of the fundamental causes it now claims. Always the problem between Israel and the Palestinians are blamed upon Israel. That despised country alone is castigated, basically for defending itself, while those who make no secret of their determination to destroy her are justified in their terrorism and unprovoked aggression. This is true at the UN, in world media, and even at various religious peace conferences. Why didn't America or England, who was her protectorate for a while, step in and stop these terrible things? The 5th International Conference of the Sabeel Ecumenical Palestinian Liberation Theology Center, held at Jerusalem April 14 to 18, 2004, was typical. It drew more than 600 participants from over 30 countries. Speakers such as Archimandrite Attala Hanna of the Greek Orthodox Church, outspoken supporter of suicide bombers, trashed the scriptures, rejecting all of God's promises to Israel. Roman Catholic theologian Michael Pryor described the book of Exodus as a con job and Joshua as the patron saint of ethnic cleansers. The dean of Talray Kashikatia Anglican Theological College in New Zealand, convener of the Global and Anglican Peace and Justice Network, described Christian Zionism, the belief that the land of Israel, as promised by God, belongs to the Jews, as a manifest evil and insidious presence. Wow. Make yourself present. Make yourself public. Israel is presented at such conferences as it is at the United Nations and in world media as the aggressor, a land grabber illegally occupying Palestinian land taken from its rightful owners by brute force. As we have seen, those who call themselves Palestinians, a name taken from the Philistines, Israel's ancient enemy, a heritage claimed by Arafat, claimed to be